You're listening to the Business Communicators.
Guys, let's talk about the situation in Texas. And for those of you that have been living under a rock for the past week, it's not really breaking news that Texans, myself, Thomas, Hattie, we can't handle the cold. Winter Storm Uri basically knocked out the state of Texas. And for those not familiar with the situation, really quickly, Texas is on its own power grid. And this is kind of where the main issues came. So in the United States, there are three main power grids. You've got the West Coast, you've got the East Coast, and then Texas deregulated several years ago. Now, what this means is if there's a crisis in California, California can draw energy from neighboring states to help, mitigate some of the strain on the power grid. So they can hopefully keep, people's homes warm and energized. They might have to do rolling blackouts, but at least it's not prolonged. We'll put it that way. Texas, on the other hand, they are under control of the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, also known as ERCOT, which is just completely ironic in itself. And Texas has prided itself on being independent and staying away from federal regulations. And as a result of wind turbines freezing, natural gas pipelines freezing, nuclear power plants going offline, Texas was hammered on Sunday night into Monday morning, and millions of people lost power in their homes. Currently in Texas, Thomas and I believe got power back 3 days after everything went off. Our city is still under a boil water notice, so it's very difficult to find grocery stores within the state of Texas that have supplies, even as simple as water and food. So that's incredibly challenging for the state. And because Texas is independent, we can't draw on other states' energy resources for support. So we're not going to focus on exactly what happened, but more the communications side of it and the crisis.
Lack of communications.
Lack of communication. Yeah.
Sorry to interject there, Austin, but it had to be said.
Yeah, the lack of communications and effective crisis management. And Thomas and Dan, when I look at this situation in Texas, I think it was a disaster from the start. Many public officials, government officials, ERCOT, they knew that this storm was coming for weeks. Preparedness was not there. Communicating to your citizens on what to do, how to conserve and manage power, that was not done. And even when we look at the system itself, there have been studies done plenty of times over the past decade saying that Texas needs to winterize or weatherize its power grid. They did not do that in order to save money. And here we are, just a few days removed from about a third of the state not having power, and most of the state right now not even having access to clean water. How do we get here?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because ERCOT being the governing body of the power grid, for lack of a better statement, I think that's what makes Texans so frustrated about the whole ordeal, was that we knew it was coming. And it wasn't like a week or a day. It was like, here's 3 weeks. There's some big storms coming down. Let's prepare. Because the power outages weren't from fallen lines. They weren't from the natural disaster itself. It was because we self-inflicted it. And so I think that's why the Texans are the most upset about it, is because it's the freezing pipes. Yeah, that's more Mother Nature. Granted, having power probably would have prevented a lot more of them from breaking. But that's what it is. The real challenge is when all this information is going on, and so you have all these people doing without power, but yet they're broadcasting their messages through television. I don't know how you get to see that. And then by the power being out means that everybody's home internet was down. So now your cell phone signals and your websites were now spotty at best. You'd send a message and you'd get either confirmation that it went through an hour later, or that it didn't get through 2 hours later. And so a lot of the information was coming just from different areas. I thought it was really interesting that just the blame game that immediately started just
within hours.
Yeah. And it reminds me of a quote. I got to pull it up so I quote it properly, because I won't do it justice. It is from The Big Short, about looking at the crisis thing. Is the truth at this time is like poetry, and people don't like poetry. I paraphrased it and I used the clean version of it for our listeners. And in crisis management, it's the empathy. This has case study on top of case study on top of case study of it. I think Austin said it best when the last message that went out from ERCOT was at 4:59, and they were radio silence till 8:00 the next morning.
Yeah. That's a huge issue. And I think that one thing that everyone is taught if they've gone through crisis communications training, and if you haven't gone through crisis communications training, FEMA is a really good resource. They have the incident command staff, which is ICS 100, 200, and 300. Dan, I'm not sure what it is in Canada, but it's really good training that I think every communicator should know. And for businesses, at least in my background, you're taught a few things initially when a crisis happens. One, always overreact and then assess status. Overreacting means that you're putting resources on standby. You're letting people know, hey, this potential storm is coming. Hey, this disaster happened. Get ready. We don't know if we're going to need you, but we're putting you on standby just in case we have to deploy you. And then your priorities have to be people. They have to be the environment, then the property, and then the business. The problem with ERCOT is they knew this was coming for a week. And I know that storms are unpredictable, but they knew that it was coming for a week, and none of those priorities were checked off. Dan, as an outsider, not being from Texas, what are your initial thoughts on this crisis, and what steps would you take from a crisis comms perspective to maybe do this again or do this differently, or, advice that you would give for companies maybe going through something similar in the future?
The issues management on this has been appalling. I haven't seen everything from within the organization. There hasn't been a post-mortem of those processes and procedures, and that will come out in the wash. If there isn't a transparent learning and listening and learning exercise from that, and procedures changed as a result, there will be people culpable, and the failures must not be allowed to happen again. The common issue that I see around this is that an organization says, well, it's a 1 in 1,000 year event, 1 in 100, 1 in 200. It's not, so we're not going to put resources into this because we've got pressures, blah blah. And some of those justifications may be legitimate, but when you're inside that bubble of that organization, too often it's very easy to go, yeah, that makes sense. I can look at my budget and the likelihood of this, what are the odds? Back home, every time it snows, and it snows in England, Scotland's slightly different, but in England it snows maybe 1 to 3 days a year. It's about that much, and it turns into sludge. The country stops, and immediately everyone comes out and goes, why weren't we prepared for this? Well, it wasn't the environment for it. We're not going to have snow clearing machines and put that money into it. Well, that makes sense if you look at it from a budget point of view. But when you look at the human impact point of view, it's something very different. So you do these ongoing assessments. For organizations, it's no different. I think that what you've both identified and spoken quite clearly about here is that this wasn't something that came on in 20 minutes, 40 minutes, 2 hours, or even the night before. It was seen to be coming. So I would take lessons from this. Look, there's very dark sides of any tragedy. There's dark sides of anything like this that happens, and they're called crises for a reason. But again, for private organizations, look at things like this and look at that guidance and just say, okay, well, if this was my organization, what could I do? How could I apply lessons from this to what we do? And one of the things when I part of my role is crisis communications training. One of the things I say to people is, let's go to a whiteboard and throw up all the things that could happen to your organization. Let's put them into 3 columns. Probably, maybe, and unlikely. With those 3 columns, just put all the events that you could think that could impact you, your customers, your reputation, your supply chain. How about your organization getting crippled by something happening on the other side of the country because they're in your supply chain? Put it on the board, look at it, and then run through the scenarios. I'm sorry to say, storms happen. Nature happens. If that board had been looked at properly, regardless of the budget, it would have been very easy to go, okay, well, how are we going to deliver our messages in a timely fashion? Because as you know, within a crisis, communicating in a timely fashion is critical, and making sure that your message isn't only broadcast, but it's heard and it's understood and acted on. What can we do to make sure that the messages that are going out are understood, complied with? I mean, let's say there was an evacuation order and something just went out, some other, crisis scenario. Instruction went out to people to go, hey, you got to get out of location X, but you put it in a format or in a place where no one gets to see that message. I'm not going to talk about effectiveness of message. How does that actually impact the human beings? How does that save people's lives? And it's always the case for me, working back, worst case scenario, preparation, get that planning in place and run scenarios. How many times do organizations have a great crisis plan or a folder, the binder in the office, the binder at home, maybe a digital version on the phone or whatever it is, but then it's not updated, and it was done maybe 7 years ago, but no one's opened the folder, or we haven't really looked at it. And the truth is, as along with your fire drills that you do in your business, along with checking the integrity of the passwords for your organization, that crisis plan should be rehearsed, reviewed, updated, tested. If it isn't, it's a structural failure for the organization.
100%. I think, I worked in the energy industry for 9 years. And the company that I worked for had a major crisis back in 2010, one that almost crippled the company. And the company is still, feeling the effects of it today. But one of the things that we did is every year we would do 2 to 3 crisis drills. We would do them at different assets. We would do them with different government officials. And I think it was helpful for us in preparing for even the minor crises that we had. The onset of COVID-19, I was the public information officer for the first 2 weeks of that crisis in the Gulf of Mexico. And I think my training helped me lead an effective communications plan. And granted, we weren't externally communicating. We had to build up an incident management team specifically for our employees and communicating our COVID response, especially for the offshore employees. And I think that was so critical. And we were prepared. We were wargaming this, weeks before the crisis became a crisis. And I think that, you have to have that foresight when it comes to communications. And something that I kind of want to go back to that Thomas mentioned a little bit earlier, and Dan, you alluded to this as well. Communication channels are also so important. What happened, what worked 10 years ago, putting stuff out there on TV and radio, that's not how people operate today. People aren't going to go sit in their cars and listen to FM radio. I couldn't tell you the last time that I listened to a radio station. Most of the time when I listen to something now, it's on Spotify or a podcast app. I'm not listening to FM radio stations. I don't even know what the FM radio stations are here in Houston. Is that on me? Probably a little bit, but you've got to go where the people are. Is it social media? Is it text alerts? Is there some sort of emergency response number that can call people? I think that this is something that the state has to modernize, and the country really has to modernize in order to meet Americans where they are when it comes to advancing technology. So maybe that, means working with Silicon Valley, trying to leverage some sort of app, or maybe it's working with the telecom industry and trying to figure out a text messaging system. But when you look back at ERCOT and some of their initial communications, they were trying to take that Wendy's roasting approach for some of their first initial comments. And these tweets are still up, by the way, as the time that we're recording, which is Friday afternoon. And so we'll put them on the screen right now if you're watching this on YouTube. But they sent one out that said, "Close your blinds to conserve heat." It's a pretty good message, right? Pretty straightforward. That's a great piece of advice. But then they close it with this: "You already know what it looks like outside." It's a little bit tone deaf. Here's another one. The message is unplug the fancy new appliances you bought during the pandemic and only used once. #conserve. Why not just say unplug appliances? It could create an issue when the power does come back online. Like, why be snarky? Especially when you're not openly, transparently communicating with the public. Why take this approach on social media?
I'd just like to say on that point, communication generally, when you are an organization which is a trust-based, utility-facing organization, you're not in the consumer space. It's not necessarily your game to be funny. And when it's media training away from crisis, or maybe it's a part of crisis, I say to organizations anyway, how funny do you think you are? Room full of people, back when we had a room full of people, but a room full of people. And I'd say to them, okay, who's the funniest in the room? And they'll all point to someone. And then they'll say something funny. It'll be great. And there was this one time I was doing media training. There was this person who was amazing in the room. We recorded it. We then went into interview, and their defense mechanism was actually humor. They were just one of those funny people who had quips, and they we were interviewing them, and they got nervous, and there were these things that they were saying. But when we did playback, they looked at themselves, because we always say, hey, you tell us what you think, then what does the room think, and then we'll tell you what we think, and we'll give you the pointers. Let's really learn from this. How disrespectful it came across, how flippant it came across, how arrogant it came across. And from what you're saying of these messages, that's exactly where I'd be with the sensitivity around this, remembering that the use of humor is a great tool for messaging in the right space at the right time. But a bit like, a grandmaster painting or modern art, it's all, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's how I perceive what you're saying. And from those messages from ERCOT, I look at that and go, wow. It to me, it feels disrespectful. And when something feels bad, you can't quantify that by, let's see what the responses are on Hootsuite or whatever it is. What's the sentiment like? Oh yeah, we really got that wrong.
It's interesting because I come from it a little different. I haven't had the crisis media training. I've had the crisis management training. And so I've had to look at, how do we get people out? When was the last time the crisis plan was really there? And I come from this, simple point to the point. And I think it's interesting that Austin made a military reference, because I believe in that training, so that you train enough that it's second nature. So you're not thinking about it. If something's happening, this is what you do. You don't have time to think. You only have time to act. But even with that, with the media or the crisis management training, I think it's funny because you're talking about making all your list. I've always sat down to the room. Well, what about this? And anytime the C-suite says, well, that's never going to happen here, that's the first one we work on, period.
It's the same thing with that Mike Tyson quote, right? You can have the best game plan going into a boxing match, but it all goes out the window when you get punched in the face. It's the exact same thing in a crisis situation. Once you get knocked down, you've got to use your training. You've got to rely on your skills to be able to get back up and work through it. And I think the state of Texas, ERCOT, our government officials, I think they failed. And Thomas, I do want to ask you about this, because you this is one of the first things that you mentioned. When this whole crisis started, it was less than 24 hours before you had Republican government officials pointing the finger at renewable energy and wind, when the bulk of the problem was actually natural gas pipelines freezing and then a nuclear power plant going offline. So they were trying to make this political within the first 24 hours. And then at the local level, you have government officials that are doing the right thing. They're obviously saying that their top priority is the people and trying to restore power to get it back on as quickly as possible. But then they're pointing the fingers up at the state level. And then the power companies so just for more context, here we have CenterPoint Energy. And CenterPoint energy is more the distributor, right? So they can go to the ERCOT power grid and then distribute the energy that's there to its subscribers, its customers, as they call them. They were pointing the finger at ERCOT. And it was just so frustrating to see the lack of collaboration from our local, our federal, and our state level, stakeholders, and then also the business world. And I feel like that is not indicative of how Texas has responded in the past. I mean, we've seen the good from companies like H-E-B, which is a huge grocery store here in Texas, Mattress Mac, opening up his doors at Gallery Furniture and bringing in, so many people. Why couldn't we get it right this time, Thomas?
You talk about the communications playbook. I'm starting to think that there's a politician's playbook, because you saw this during Katrina. The local government blamed the state government blamed the federal government. Here you see the local blaming the state blaming the state. Federal doesn't really have as much to play with it because we are our own power grid, so the federal government doesn't have a whole lot to do with it. I quickly, before the podcast, was doing a little research, and 8 days after Katrina struck, state and federal officials said they're finally starting to work together. This was the CBS report on September 7th. The other challenge is that the weather event, it happens about every 10 years, and every 10 years they're told this is what it's going to warn about. And to finish off quoting another movie, The Big Short, I have a feeling that in a few years people are going to be doing exactly what they did when the economy tanks. They're going to point the fingers at each other, nothing's going to happen, and we're going to be right back to normal. So politicians, if you're listening, please work with your communications experts to help a communications plan, not a politician plan. Or you can do what one of our politicians did and just fly to Cancun where it was 80 degrees.
Yeah. A note to the politicians out there. I don't care if you're liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat. I guess we do have to throw in libertarian in there too. During times of crisis, it's not about you. It's about the people that you represent. And keep that at the top of your mind when responding to a crisis. Know that if you want to get reelected in 6 years and 4 years and 2 years, you've got to take care of the people. You've got to show that you stepped up, that you worked across the aisle, and that you led in a time of crisis. And I'm not sure that I saw that with our leaders. And I think that was incredibly frustrating. But I'll tell you one good thing that I did find. And it was on social media. Facebook, which has taken a lot of heat over the years, for spreading misinformation, for too much data. I think that one thing that Facebook does incredibly well is they can bring people together and find resources. I mean, I remember after Hurricane Harvey, there were groups that were set up in Houston. If you needed people to help clear out your home or fix, drywall or bring supplies, you could find groups like that on Facebook, and people were sharing updates. It was just so incredible to see the community rally behind each other. And today when I logged onto Facebook, so Friday afternoon, there was a post, and I'll put it up on the screen right now if you're watching on YouTube. It says, Austin, help people in your area affected by the winter storm. Together, we can help support each other during the extreme weather and power outages. Let people near you know if you need or can offer supplies, volunteer services, or other types of assistance. And then there's a place where you can scroll, and you can see if people have medical requests, if they have a family that's going through a healthcare situation and they need power. If someone is trying to find a local plumber, you can find it on Facebook. So I do want to give kudos to Facebook and kind of stepping up and helping the community collaborate and work through this together. And I think in this case, it's big tech doing good for society.
I think that's interesting because Facebook, for a long time, I think it was after the tsunamis in the Philippines, where they had the check-in that you send one message, I'm okay, to your friends and family, so they didn't have to go through all of that information. Looking at journalism.org, 18% of people get their news or information from that. And the whole purpose for the social media was to be able to talk to your friends, not necessarily to sway political views or anything like that, or to show pictures of your kids to your family. What was the whole purpose of social media? And so I think that's good that they're getting back to what it is they originally were designed to do.
Yeah, it's
connect people.
It's connecting people. It's bringing together community, and I think that's incredibly important. And I would like to see social media continue to do that. I mean, Dan, up in Canada, when you have cold climates or you have some sort of issue that's going on in the community, I imagine it's a similar situation with people sharing information and in trying to help one another via these social media platforms.
I have to say the invention of groups has been the biggest single game changer to the Facebook ecosystem, particularly because suddenly, based on geography, it could be people that you're not directly connected with your friend group or whatever it might be, but it will be people who are physical neighbors or within your neighborhood, and you can really help people. I put a message out recently and someone else replied, and they helped our family, and it was an amazing change. But one of the things that is fascinating to me is there's one part which is, it's very easy for us to demonize social media platforms because of what people do on those platforms. But actually the people are human beings. It's people like us and people very much not like us, and this collision of different ethics and beliefs and different ways of thinking, and some who are very forward in their opinions and others who will shrink and not say things, and those who will be hurt by it. I think that things like that you've mentioned, Austin, with those facilities bringing people together purposefully for good is fantastic. But I've seen equal amounts of good and bad on every platform. Even down to Clubhouse in the last week, I've heard things that have been, anti one group, anti another group, and then pro. It just depends the conversation that you're involved with. I do believe there is responsibility from the platforms to manage these situations in a more effective way. But it's a difficult space. And would I like to go out and create a social network and invest in it and put all those billions in and get an awful lot back from it? Sure. But the level of responsibility when we've got to talk about our fellow human beings and a platform, it's almost the demonization of a platform or a technology, when actually the problem is how society deals with itself, and we speak to each other as much as anything.
You've been listening to the Business Communicators.